Hey, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is when we started doing these lunch and learns. This was one of the first ones that came up that we wanted to do, and we weren't sure there was going to be an audience. And so I'm so glad to be wrong in this regard. And I think it's entirely because of the man himself. He has such a way of talking about history that it's just, you just want to sit there and be there forever. And so it's amazing. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. John Thelin.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you. My thanks to John and to Danae Wilson. A few weeks ago, I think it was about sunny and 70 degrees, they called me and asked me about giving a talk, and I think I waited all of about 3 seconds to say yes. Last Tuesday night, as the temperature dropped about 10 degrees every 15 minutes, I was teaching a graduate seminar, and we were kind of watching for the snow, and then we got the notice that UK would cancel on Wednesday. That was good news for my graduate students who were going to have to drive through the snow. It was disappointing to me because it meant canceling the talk last week. Well, thanks to Danae and John, we promptly rescheduled. So I'm glad to be here. They even updated my slides to have our new date, and they did not use Helvetica type font to intrude on my Times New Roman. So the world's in good order. You'll notice that I arrived on time. There's a story behind that. Whenever I have a meeting across campus, I have to build in a lot of allowance. For example, I started walking to my office at about 10 o'clock. It's about a quarter mile away. There are 2 reasons of that are very much connected to our talk today. One is I love to look at campus buildings and architectures and artifacts. So I have to allow for that, particularly if I'm like heading over to the Young Library or to the Med Center. The second is about you, and that is that thing that is, I think, distinctive and great about UK is I bump into so many staff with whom I've worked and to whom I'm indebted for a range of services. They bailed me out of problems. Even the parking office, they're kind when they tow my car, and whether it be registrars, academic advising, buildings and grounds. I see Tom Harris here helping me with government relations, namely like bailing me out. So I think what this shows to me is how interdependent a university is. And I think that there used to be an expression, it takes a village. And I've updated that in amendment. What I say is that it takes staff to make a campus into a community, and you've done that. So it's just a very great honor to join with you today. I'm not an architect. What I am is one who I've had a half-century lover's quarrel with campuses. And I love looking at buildings and small things. For example, when I go into the Whitehall classroom building, there's a stairwell that goes down to the post office. And I'm fascinated. There's this closet door that's about 3 feet high. And I'm tempted, I want to put a sign in it that says something like the Jockey's Club. I have no idea what it's used for, but those are part of the small mysteries of the UK campus that I want to talk about a little today. Now, I've not been accused of being very deep in my research, but I am pervasive at it. Now, for example, some years ago, I was in a dentist office, and I did my research by reading an issue of Southern Living. And here's one of their articles that truly captured what I'm interested in and have tried to convey. And it was called Walk Through History on Campus. And it offered these kind of photographic profiles and short captions about 10 campuses in the South. And it was inviting people, saying that, emphasizing that visiting universities and colleges in the South, particularly during the autumn, was a great way to rediscover history, to bring it to life, to observe sometimes nostalgia, famous landmarks. UK was not in their profile of institutions. Like promptly dashed off an irate letter to the editor demanding a recount and an update. So I've taken that on to add my own version. So let's take a bit of a tour. What I wanted to keep in mind is that the selections that I present today are highly idiosyncratic and personal. And what I want you to be thinking about is, if you were to tell your own story about campus explorations, what you observe, what you remember, why certain buildings have good memories for you, kind of write your own story. And I one time had an exercise that I would do in a short course that I was teaching. And I would ask members of the group to take out a blank piece of paper and reconstruct what their typical daily route was when they were an undergraduate. And invariably these zigzags all over, with energy going from like 7 a.m. to midnight. Then I asked people to then do what was their route as an employee. And invariably you could take a straight edge, and it was like from parking structure to office back to parking structure. But I want to know kind of how you animate the campus. How do we bring the stage set of a university? How do we bring it to life? All right, so let's go back a little bit. This is a postcard, like a picture postcard to be sold at the airports and whatever, an aerial view of our University of Kentucky in 1955. And the puzzle and the paradox to me of a campus is that it's simultaneously very historic, yet also very changing and modern. And so if we go back to 1955, we see much that is familiar. You see the main building, the Long, the Peterson building. But look again, there's no Med Center. There's no Rupp Arena. There's no Kroger Field. But so we see, then we also will see, we'll talk a little bit more, we'll see Avenue of Champions with wonderful Stoll Field that seated about 35,000. It's interesting to remember, when you infiltrate behind enemy lines, you have to know the trivia. Right. It's Stoll Field, but what is the name of the stadium? McLean. Yes. Named in honor of a UK football player who was tragically died in a practice accident. So give you some hints at now how a history, a university retains its history. We remember some of our memorable students and alums, but also at the same time, universities also build new buildings and sometimes modify or tear some down.
I'm terribly sorry to interrupt. You got a little far from the mic there.
All right, I'm deadly. All right, my range. Okay, all right. Okay, great. All right. Nothing I say leaves this room. Okay. So, but use this as one grounding for our campus tour. We rediscover what UK was, what it is, and what it may be. One time I was walking on Avenue of Champions, and a group of visitors stopped me and said, "Excuse me, can you tell me where we can go to the KFC?" They were looking for Colonel Sanders and fried chicken. But as many of you know, I have a severe hearing loss. And I thought they said KFC. So what did I do? I said, why, yes, it's over by Barker Hall. So they sent them to Barker Hall. and this is hard to see, but if you look at the lantern behind it, it's what I call kind of 19th century branding, kind of a pre-neon sign. It wasn't KFC, it was KSC. And at that time, our University of Kentucky was known officially and in popular usage, it was KSC, Kentucky State College. So it's interesting that we have some of these artifacts that remind us of the evolution of the campus. And they certainly can't compete with neon signs or whatever, but I'm pleased that we at least retain some connection with our names and our roots. And interesting is with all the really large, wonderful campus construction, still it's interesting that our icon often are some buildings that have been kind of dwarfed in recent years. But I've always had a special fondness for Memorial Hall as one of the symbols of our campus. And to this day, when the first week I arrived at UK, new faculty were given a book bag. And of course, it had on it what was then the official logo, and nestled in between the U and the K was a wonderful stylized characterization of Memorial Hall. And it's always had a fond place for me, and also very useful as I still bring this bag along with me. So our older buildings coexist with a blend of newer and larger buildings. For example, one of my favorite headlines, actually the whole issue, came from December 12th. Headline that just brought joy to me. One headline says, UK's $500 million plan fixes old, constructs new buildings. There's our story, this confluence of old and new. An institution does not become fossilized. It continues to rebuild, re-examine, sometimes renovating, and so on. And what was even better, really a good day for UK, to the right, developer gives $10 million to help UK students from Mirabal. What a day. Hard to top that. And so, as these examples of Memorial Hall, whether it be on my book bag or in the postcard or in the logo, which I noticed, by the way, as I walk around campus, there still are sections of the campus where the older logo still persists, alongside with the newer block UK. One of the things that's crucial to our identity here is that we are a land grant institution. And we're actually one of a handful of state universities that are both the flagship state university and the land grant, referring back to the Morrill Act of 1862. And step aside from UK, oops. Step aside from UK, go to a more kind of national popular culture. This is the Saturday Evening Post cover, which in the 1950s probably had a weekly circulation of about 10 million. It was about as prominent as you could be. And it's a Norman Rockwell painting that depicts a young man, and if you look at his suitcase, it says State U. And I think it embodies one strand of the land grant legacy, is the idea that that our state universities would provide access and opportunity, often for first-gen students. And if you look at his father, who's had very rough hands, obviously been working as a rancher or farmer. And you'll notice the sun is kind of looking off to the distance. I'd like to think to the future. And so there's this kind of mixed legacy in that going away to college is truly the consummate American dream. Yet with it comes dislocations and change. It may be that you are breaking your home ties. Who knows what happens after a high school student goes to the university and earns a degree? Will they return home? Will they go to the big city or whatever? But it's still a very poignant image, and I think it ties very much to what UK's historic mission has been. We're not far from Euclid Avenue, which I do like its name of the Avenue of Champions. And it would be unlikely to think of the University of Kentucky without including central prominent mention of its incredible college sports heritage. And at the time where we have state-of-the-art facilities, let us say at Rupp Arena or at Kroger Field, I still am just very, very impressed by the legacy of some of our earlier facilities, some of which we still have, some of which have been renovated or sometimes taken down. So let's take a look. This was from the 1920s, the construction of what would be McLean Field, or McLean Stadium on Stoll Field. And it was a pretty big deal. It was just a delightful stadium, kind of classical in its motif. It seated about, I think, 36,000, which was large for that era. And also what's interesting is that I compare a campus of, let's say, an earlier era as being much more like cities when they had railroad stations, whereas today, a campus is more like a city with an airport. In an earlier era, you had to have a railroad station kind of in the center of town. People had to arrive, so you brought people in the campus. And what we have on the Avenue of Champions is a kind of classic portrayal of that, where you have right across the street from one another, you have what was then a state-of-the-art football stadium, and across from it, truly the gold standard of a basketball arena with Memorial Coliseum that was built in the late 1940s and opened in 1950. And so truly it was an avenue of champions with this concentration of facilities, and where you had, for example, UK winning NIT and NCAA basketball championships, and Bear Bryant as football coach winning the Sugar Bowl. It was just remarkable for a relatively small state university to have this national presence. So it was an avenue of champions. And here's some of the architects' renditions of what the Memorial Coliseum was going to look like. And not too many years ago, I remember we still had commencement at Memorial Coliseum. And all right, the building, is getting old, aren't we all? Except for some of you. But I still found it just impressive in terms of like the ramps and the size. It's kind of like classic mid-modern architecture. And I recall we were waiting in the academic procession. They have these wonderful plaques with an honor roll commemorating those Kentuckians who had served and given their lives in wars. So there was not only athletics, but there was a sense of connection to the state. And a few years ago, I went over to Memorial Coliseum for some taping, for some session or whatever, and the labyrinth just still remains large and impressive and complex to me. So I imagine what an impact it made on the university at the time of its construction. And then here's one of the other picture postcards from the early 1950s. So in a sense, some of these athletic facilities did put UK on the map. what I want to turn to is how UK in the last several decades has made this evolution and transformation into becoming a truly modern university. And there's some riddles and puzzles that campus planning involves. For example, in certain fields such as the health sciences, medicine, engineering, it's very, very difficult to renovate a building. New demands on wiring, technology, structural limits, or whatever, so that usually as you move into high-tech fields, it pretty much requires new structures. So we get this mix of old and new. And this is from about, 2005. It seemed to me that was a time when I can't remember when there was not a major construction project, not only on campus or close by. And one thing that I think is useful to do when you think about the ecology of a campus, it's not only academic buildings and buildings that are officially part of the university, it's also the adjacent neighborhoods and the surrounding, whether it be restaurants or bookstores or whatever. It makes it a true extended community. With growth comes automobiles. There used to be a quip by a famous university president, said that the key to being a successful president was that you had to have athletics for the alumni, social life for the students, and parking for the faculty. I think I'd update that and say I think everybody wants parking. I've often wondered if maybe someday we'll have a logo instead of Memorial Hall. Maybe we'll have like the hospital parking complex will be the iconic building that's actually starting to look picturesque and certainly useful. This photograph reminds me of like the 20th century equivalent of building the Palace of Versailles. And I can't remember when there wasn't construction going on. And not the least, which is Patterson Office Tower, which is now becoming quite historic. So construction and renewal has become part of our ongoing story. And here we are in the Gatton Student Center. Yesterday, I was over at the Gatton School of Business, which I refer to as the Cathedral of Commerce. It's picturesque and impressive, but I always try to look for some of the side stories that preface the completion of this magnificent building. I always, you know how there's a tradition where you name buildings after donors. If I was a betting man like Pete Rose, I would say, I think the Tyvek family has made the campus a richer place. But with all good things, it too must pass, followed by a brick covering. But they had their moment. Oops. One of the things that fascinates me about our university campus is who is it that we honor in addition to the Tyvek family or the Gaps or whatever. But walking along Limestone, turning the Nicholasville Road on my way to Nice and Pan, I passed by the Sam Whalen building. And, you know, for years I'd walked by that. Finally, I came to my senses and said, who was Sam Whalen? What does a guy have to do to get a building named after you? So I did a little bit of research. But anyone know the answer? Well, if you don't, I can see anything I want. You won't be able to do that. No, Sam Whalen was a distinguished UK alum who gained fame and respect in civil engineering and in transportation planning. And so, you know, what a great tribute. And so one of the exercises that I hope that you'll do is, as you explore and walk around the campus, keep an eye open for, you know, who are we honoring and who are we naming buildings after? Uh, what does one do in order to warrant being recognized? It can be donors, it can be distinguished alums, it can be students. For example, for years, I would watch the campus buses go by, and often there would be the placard that would say, Greg Page Complex. And so it's kind of out of neutrality and difference. Oh, yes, Greg Page. But in fact, it's very, very important that we honored Greg Page, who was one of the pioneering heroic student athletes, African-American football player at UK, who tragically was killed in practice. And I think it's very good and important that the university has remembered him. And what I hear in some of my discussions with some what I call seasoned veterans of the campus is that for his funeral, the president of UK, the board of trustees, the governor of the state, the entire coaching staff took the time to go to Owensboro to meet with his family and for his memorial service. And so I think that's a good side of our university when we acknowledge our truly, truly distinguished and memorable members of our campus community. Nothing is so permanent as a temporary appointment. I wish I could take credit for coining that phrase. Actually, I lifted it from Oscar Wilde. But I think it makes sense when you walk around the campus. Almost every American college and university during World War II faced an influx of students, of military training programs, all kinds of civilian efforts. And at UK and elsewhere, one of the symbols or signs of that were these kind of wooden barracks buildings. The plan was that they would last about 3 years. Well, nothing is so permanent, more or less, as a temporary appointment. And what happens is that in many campuses, the barracks buildings continue to be used and recycled. And I often, what was the standard? Was that kind of like being sent to the doghouse or being called to the principal's office as the air conditioning didn't work or whatever? But eventually, many good things must come to an end. And it was last year, or 2017, that finally the temporary Scott Street Barracks building was torn down. Familiar to all of us, Patterson Office Tower. I believe in conspiracy theories. I think what happened in the early 1960s, there was an international exchange, and there was an architecture student, an engineering student from the Soviet Union who came to UK and had such a great experience. His farewell present was to leave the blueprints for his Moscow apartment building as a present to UK, to which, and it was very authentic because like the elevators only worked a third of the time, plumbing would go out or whatever. But on a serious note, one thing I try to keep an eye open for on a campus is, are there ways that an institution reconciles new construction with remembering the past, at least in some partial way? And hard to see, but what I've always enjoyed was if you look at the the ground floor, in addition to the stately wooden double doors as you go in, you'll notice you can see kind of red-brown brick. What I thought was thoughtful is that although the building is overwhelmingly postmodern reinforced concrete, in fact, the architects and engineers and campus leaders took time to salvage and recycle the bricks that were at the Carnegie Library building that had stood on that place. And it's actually, I think, very, very impressive when you go into the lobby and there are like seminar rooms and whatever. It's very, very different atmosphere than, let's say, subsequent floors, which have more modern materials and textures. But there's at least some acknowledgement of what came before. So it's a small and I think thoughtful, important gesture. I want to go back to the land grant legacy. In addition to, say, agriculture, when we say A&M, agriculture, right, what does the M stand for?
Military.
Mechanical.
Military.
Wait a minute. Tastes great, less filling. Military and mechanical. The answer is both. It actually should be A&M. On the lawn in front of the main building, one observation. One week I go out there and I see ROTC practicing. The next week I see civil engineers surveying. I think it's safe to say over a century, we have the best surveyed, most well-protected plot of land in the Western Hemisphere. So I sleep very soundly with that A&M legacy. But now, there's also, of course, the canon. Couple of points about the canon and my eye for detail. The canon is facing directly at my office window. across a couple of streets past the Peterson building. I'm not paranoid because it really is true. It is aimed at me. Paranoia is when you imagine that you're like, I think it's definite and genuine. And I can appreciate the leadership being a little wary of what I have to say. But I want to warn them. I worry that their strategy of aiming that cannon at me, it literally could backfire on them. Because if you look at the cannon, it came from the Spanish-American War, which I think predates all of us. But even more historic, the cannon is Spanish, and it was cast in like 1785. I worry for the safety of whoever fires that cannon. I think there's more danger that they hurt themselves than hitting me. So suit yourself. But it is an interesting part of our heritage. And here we have the way UK looked, for example, before Patterson Office Tower. Much more open space, some impressive buildings, but not nearly as high. Oops. Now, I want to close. In a digital age, I still think sometimes it's very, very important to rely on our print media and artifacts. To me, one of the most moving episodes at UK, certainly for myself, comes from May 2001. I saved this. This was the day of the memorable and tragic fire of the main building. Background on this. I came out of my office at about 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon. It was a beautiful spring day. And I really do look right across at the main. And I thought it was snowing. So I looked out the window, there's this like mottled white coming down. I really had, is this some kind of joke? And it turned out what it was ashes. And what was interesting, about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there was this eerie momentum that gathered, and increasingly more and more people were stopping and looking and observing and scratching their heads and trying to make sense. Then, by gradation, it became evident that something very momentous and very bad was taking place. And then it became evident that it was the fire in the main building. And what I found bittersweet was that, so I hear, that the fire was caused by a welder who was actually at the last day of the job on this long, wonderful renovation project. They had made a decision to retain the original wooden beams. old wood, which are incredibly dry. And it was one of these 1,000,000 to 1 incidents or accidents in which the welding torch sparked and hit the wood and then created this incredible fire. Now, the point that I want to close with is that sometimes in a campus community, yes, architecture and buildings are important, but they are only an empty stage set without the members of the community. And what I recall was through the late afternoon and into the evening, all through the night and into the morning, growing numbers of people gathered on the lawn. And you would find, for example, an undergraduate talking to an alum from the class of 1931. You would find faculty and staff, all roles. And there are these wonderful recollections. What you learned was all the different purposes that the main building had been used for, depending on your generation. There were like at one time, evidently, it was used as an infirmary. I remember a group of aging fraternity brothers who remembered that it was the registrar's office, and it led them to believe, hey, well, this means my transcripts are now burned. And suddenly, they all claimed to be Phi Beta Kappa. And so, but there was this growing, and across generations, people were talking. And so, out of the adversity, what I likened to kind of the phoenix rising from the ashes was this kind of resolve and pulling together, and this phenomenon where a very tragic bad incident had the social consequence of making us talk to one another, appreciate, join together, crossing boundaries, and with a resolve to rebuild and to endure. And so, to me, that is the legacy that makes UK memorable, and that you have made UK a great place to work and be a part of this community. Let me close because I'm a historian. Back over a century ago at the University of California, Berkeley, there was a distinguished president of the university who was scheduled to give a talk. And he was known for being pompous and long-winded. So he gets up to the podium and he halts, and he kind of he looks out over his audience, and he kind of suspends his highly formal remarks, and he lapses into a more natural, humane character. And what he says is, it's so good to be here. Did I say to you? Thank you. My hearing is about as limited as this microphone, but as your time permits, I would be pleased with John's assistance to hear your comments, your recollections, or questions.
Now, for those who haven't never been to one, a plush microphone, so I might be throwing it. I usually have pretty good aim, but do be prepared to duck. Randy, did you have your hand up?
Okay, do you tumbling around? So anyway, last fall, I guess I was walking to campus, which I do most days, and a couple stopped me, middle-aged couple stopped me and asked me about a railroad out front of the main building. There used to be, in their opinion, their thoughts, there was a caboose on a set of railroad tracks that sat in front of the main building, and they were wondering what happened to that. If it was there, it predates my time here, so I was wondering if you knew anything about that.
I feel as if
The main building? Right. And he wasn't sure if you'd ever heard of it.
John.
that it's before my time.
Wait, we have lots of people.
But what I wonder, I mean, in an earlier era, intracity trolleys or whatever, but I don't know.
Actually answer the question. If you like.
Sure.
Answer the question, John. So there used to be there was a railroad that connected Frankfurt and Lexington, and it was part of that railroad. And there was a railroad track there, and then an engine, and it was between the Gatton building and the engineering building. The engine was there for a short period of time, early part of the 20th century in 1911. You can find reference to it online. The railroad tracks were removed as part of the renovation to the Gatton building. I know because I was involved in the process. Yes, when we started the project and we're doing the work on the site, they were removed and they're in storage. The engine had left a long time, long before John was here. Actually, it's so long ago. And so there's a story. It used to be there, was there shortly in the early part of the 20th century. Railroad tracks were there for a longer period of time. It was in honor of a railroad that went between two places that the College of Engineering had been involved in.
Have additions to that?
No, I just
Same.
I'm same thing. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Chuck Combs. I work at the hospital, and I was an undergraduate in 1973. But this story comes from about the construction of the med center. I worked with a woman on staff whose father was in the College of Ag, and at the time the med center construction was announced, that property was being used as research plots. If you remember, there were greenhouses that just recently got torn down by what we now call the old pharmacy building. There were greenhouses there. Those were remnants of when the College of Ag had that property. Well, so this was announced that the med center was going to be built there. He had research plants growing. So he said, no, you can't do this. This will, interrupt my research. I said, no, you got to go somewhere else. So she told me that when the surveyors started going out, they would plant stakes in his crop area, his crop research plots. He would go out at night and put stakes up and move. And so UK, if nothing else, is always about property and interdepartmental conflict, so anyway.
By the way, I have one semester of NCAA eligibility left.
That's kind of intimidating. Do you know, some people may know that there was a lake where we're sitting right here. There was a lake between roughly the main campus and what would have been the women's residential halls, right? When did they drain that lake? Do you know? Does anyone?
I've seen lithographs
Mm-hmm.
from I think about 1910 or so. So I don't know. It's probably early 20th century, I would imagine.
Right. Or
Did the victor go to school?
She's going to pass it to me anyway. What can you tell us about the current police department on 305 Euclid Avenue? I heard something about it used to be graduate student housing for people like World War II veterans. Do you know anything about that?
What was the incident?
No. What can you tell us about the history of the UK Police Department building on Euclid Avenue? Do you know anything about graduate?
Only that I recall going there, getting my parking permit, and being turned away for bad academic standing. No, I don't know. What's your hunch?
Oh, I heard something.
By the way, the rumors are usually true. You have more.
Well, Captain Franklin might be able to shed more light, but I heard something about graduate student housing for veterans. I thought World War II veterans who came back from the war.
That would certainly make sense, because that would be like comparable either like to the Scott Street building or another fixture in the post-World War II period were Quonset huts. These kind of corrugated aluminum, half-round buildings that were often used for GI housing or whatever. That's plausible. I look to my panel of experts.
That's for our veterans, not soon to be veterans training. On the training that went on here today, they taught me
Question and a comment.
fly for some mechanical engineering, a very large group of people that were here and that they were housed, but they were private housed for the most part.
Is that building
Right here.
still standing?
Yes, go up there, one has there's 7 feet.
They do work.
There's a swastika on the wall, which is not, you know what I'm talking about, that's not a swastika, but it's not meant to be a Nazi swastika. In fact, it's from India, they use there. So those houses up there, old houses, they were there. And the police department used to also be a department. I think they're built there right now. We in the wall, I can open up all the doors to the wall. Iron board falls out. So it used to be, you could really big it, repurposing it.
Hold on. John, the mic's working. So no, I have a comment and a question. First, someone about that little door you mentioned early in the presentation. It says the registrar's office used to have student records there. The seal was about 5 feet high. There was no electricity and had a dirt floor. And now the very old records can be found in a basement room beneath the far left side of Taylor. And then also there's a question. I know there are all kinds of photo archives of UK, but they aren't always in order and aren't usually tagged to show where on campus they were taken. Is there a recommended source to get a good history on locations of old campus buildings beside the King Library?
No, who I often ask is Dr. Terry Birdwhistle, who's done a lot of work on the history of the UK. My impression is that on the digital records, I mean, it's one of the better facilities, or services compared to many, many universities. So, but cataloging photographs, it's difficult. Sorry.
I'm actually with libraries, so yeah.
Oh yeah, use the mic. Don't get to throw a microphone, but that's okay.
Just hit the speak button there and it should light up.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned the Whalen building, and that caught my attention because that was my first office here at UK after I graduated. That was actually owned by the Transportation Cabinet. It was the Department of Highways back then. It was, and their division of research was housed there from the time that building was built. Well, it started in the old D.B. Terrell lab, the materials lab, and then when that building was built, their division of research moved in there, and it was owned by the Transportation Cabinet until 1980. John Y. Brown administration, they abolished the division of research, and they transferred the building and the people, I was one of those, to the university. So that's when I first became a UK employee, was when that transfer took place. But that building, and then not too long after that, once it became a UK building, then they dedicated it to Sam Whalen. But that was where the Division of Research was housed for years and years, and then the Kentucky Transportation Center. But on the topic of engineering, if you want a fascinating walk through history, walk through the engineering complex, because there's a photograph of every graduating class on the walls. Many of them are in the Ralph G. Anderson building now, and many of the older ones are actually down in the catacombs, if you will, underneath those buildings. But all the way back to like 1891, every graduating class. And in another hallway, they have pictures of faculty and of the different engineering buildings at different stages of construction back through there. So it's fascinating to watch, to look back through the old faculty pictures and realize how long some of our faculty have been here. But people who are interested in history, a walk through the engineering building looking at photographs is a fascinating thing. I just happened to do that last week, looking at my dad's picture, and it's a fascinating walk through history.
Also, in the College of Medicine, they often would have group portraits or framed thing with a head and shoulders of each member of the graduating class. Obviously, as we grow in enrollment, those either the frames get larger or the pictures get smaller to accommodate the change.
A little bit of both. As a person from the College of Medicine, it's a little bit of both.
Hi, I'm Katie, and I manage the volunteer department at UK Healthcare. And we have a ton of old scrapbooks from like Good Sam when there were auxiliary members and things like that. And we don't want to throw them away. So do you have any suggestions of where we could contact? Awesome, thank you. To kind of archive that information.
Yeah, so I'm the university archivist.
Oh, I'm gonna come see you after this. Thank you.
But just a parenthetical note, we think of like yearbooks as somewhat, ephemeral or whatever. And I think during the Supreme Court confirmation hearings, I was riveted by how important not budget statements, but yearbooks became. And I actually wrote an op-ed piece on how you could use these in a systematic way. And certainly medical school yearbooks are back in the news this week. So save those yearbooks. Or maybe destroy them, I don't know.
Yeah, thanks for this lecture. I had a question about relating campus architecture to your broader history of 21st century American education. I wonder how common University of Kentucky's history around the raising of Adamstown for the construction of Memorial Coliseum, which was a historically African-American town that housed around 80 families in the late 40s. I wonder how common that kind of land grab by American universities was in the 20th century.
I think you could add that in as a perennial event and theme. And one thing to shift away from my emphasis on historic visual images and some nostalgia is that keep in mind that in many communities, ranging from college towns to major cities, such as say Baltimore, Boston, whatever, New York City, universities frequently are the largest landowner and largest landlord and largest employer in their community. Like, for example, in New York City, I mean, this sounds outlandish, but Columbia University is the largest single landowner in Manhattan. And the same would be true, I think, for UK and Lexington and Fayette County. Now, kind of a 50th anniversary, 51 years, the volatile student demonstrations at Columbia University. One of the events that most triggered that pretty substantial protest and demonstrations involved Columbia University, which is landlocked, wanted to build a new gymnasium, athletic facility. Athletic facilities take up a lot of space. The place where they chose to move was through eminent domain into Harlem. And I think it's an understatement to say that all hell broke loose in terms of that tension between campus and community. So, and I know that happened with federal urban redevelopment monies that were very, very large in the early 1960s. And so that major urban universities such as Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, University of Chicago, these are all very urban, they collaborated with their mayor and city council and federal agencies and went wholesale into this kind of adjacent annexation and whatever. So it's very much part of the saga.
2 minutes left. Any last questions?
Speaking of athletics, that reminded me, one of the things that I thought was really cool when they did the renovation of this building is that they preserved the alumni gym.
Yes.
They renovated it, and I guess there's that athletic facility in there now, the fitness center or whatever. But that's where Kentucky won at least their first 2 national championships, right? 48 and 49, and then maybe 51 before they moved into Memorial Coliseum. So the fact that that alumni gym was preserved as part of
Yes,
this renovation,
very
I thought
nicely.
was a really cool thing.
And in addition to basketball, add to that a memorable photograph when Paul Bear Bryant accepts the UK football coaching position. He's standing in front of the old Memorial Gym with a crowd that would make Rupp Arena look tiny. So yes, that is part of the heritage. Well, all I can say is we've met our time limit, and truly the rest is history. Thank you very much.